Montana Territory, 1886. While every homesteader raced to throw up the quickest cabin before winter, 12 by 14 feet, single roof, short eaves, one Swiss immigrant was still building in late September. His neighbors called it dangerous. They called him a fool. Johann Meyer was constructing a second roof 3.5 inches above the first, held down with 40-pound stones every few feet. He cut continuous vents at the eaves and ridge, while others nailed their boards tight. He built 3-foot overhangs when everyone else settled for 1 foot to save lumber. Thomas Kearney, who'd learned roofing on railroad section houses, swore those stones would crush the family in their sleep. The valley called it wasteful, 2 months of work when a proper roof took 3 weeks. Then January 9th, 1887 arrived. The legendary blizzard hit without warning, 16 inches of snow in 16 hours. Temperatures plunged to 40 below zero. Standard cabins developed ice dams 12 to 18 inches thick. Meltwater backed under shingles, soaking beds and forcing families downstairs. But that dangerous double roof? The snow lay smooth and even, no ice ridge at the eaves, while the upper room stayed warm enough that 10 neighbors slept there when their own cabins failed. What did this Swiss homesteader understand about heat, snow, and roof physics that experienced American builders missed? And how did his reckless design become the foundation for what engineers now call the cold roof system? If you value stories of practical wisdom that survived the harshest tests, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts of frontier innovation worth remembering. Johann Meyer stood in the pre-dawn darkness of September 23, 1886, examining the pile of 2x4 sleepers he'd cut the day before. Around him, the Montana Territory stretched under a canopy of stars that would soon give way to another scorching day of building weather. While his neighbors had already chinked their final logs and laid their last shingle weeks ago, Johann was just beginning what they considered the most dangerous part of his entire homestead venture. The Swiss immigrant had arrived in the valley that spring with a land patent for a quarter section and ideas that struck the local builders as either brilliant or catastrophically foolish. Most homesteaders threw up the legal minimum to prove their claims: a 12 by 14-foot cabin with a single steep roof, short eaves, and walls thick enough to keep out most of the wind. Johann had chosen to build larger, a 14 by 18-foot structure that would house his family through winters he suspected might be harsher than anyone in the valley remembered. His foundation logs were hand-hewn pine, 6 to 8 inches thick and notched with the half-dovetail joints his father had taught him in the canton of Bern. The walls rose to 7 feet at the plate, topped, with a steep 8/12 pitch roof that would shed snow cleanly. Johann had framed his primary roof with 2x6 pole rafters set 24 inches on center, decked them with rough-sawn 1x8 boards, and covered the whole assembly with cedar shakes split from local timber. Any neighboring carpenter would have called it a solid, well-built cabin roof and suggested Johann move on to chinking the gaps between his logs. Instead, Johann began laying out his sleepers. The 2x4 lumber, set on edge across his completed roof, would support a second deck 3.5 inches above the first. He positioned each sleeper directly above a rafter, creating a continuous airspace that would run from the eaves to the ridgeline. Thomas Kearney, who ran cattle on the section to the north and had learned his building skills framing section houses for the Northern Pacific Railroad, stopped by to watch Johann nail down the first few pieces. "That's a lot of extra lumber for a man trying to prove up before winter," Kearney observed, leaning against his saddle horn. "Most folks around here figure one tight roof keeps the weather out just fine." Johann paused in his hammering to wipe sweat from his forehead. "In my valley, we learned that 2 roofs work better than 1 when the snow gets deep." Kearney shook his head. "This isn't Switzerland, friend. You're building for Montana weather now." But Johann continued setting his sleepers, spacing them precisely to match the rafter layout below. Over the framework, he laid another deck of 1x8 boards. This one pitched slightly flatter than the primary roof, a 4/12 slope that would encourage snow to accumulate rather than slide. He left deliberate 1-inch gaps at the lower edge and a continuous opening along the ridgeline, creating what he calculated would be roughly 1 square foot of ventilation area for every 150 square feet of roof surface. The valley's unofficial building expert, A man named Crawford, who claimed to have worked on grain elevators in Minnesota, made a point of stopping by to examine Johann's progress. "You planning to fly that contraption?" he asked, studying the double outline of rafters visible from the ground. "Looks like you're building wings instead of a roof." Johann's upper deck extended 3 feet beyond his lower eaves on all sides, creating an overhang that seemed excessive to men accustomed to the standard 1-foot projection that saved lumber and labor. But Johann remembered the chalets of his childhood, with their broad protecting eaves that kept meltwater well away from the log walls and windows. He'd calculated that his extended overhang would shed water at least 2 feet from his foundation, even in a driving rain. The real controversy began when Johann started hauling stones. He'd spent 3 days gathering 40 to 60-pound rounded boulders from the creek bottom, smooth glacial erratics that would sit securely on his upper rafters without rolling. Crawford and Kearney both warned that the added weight would collapse the structure, but Johann had framed his cabin to carry the load. His pole rafters were stout enough to handle not only the stone ballast, but the deep snow that would accumulate above them through the winter. "You're going to crush your own children in their sleep," the storekeeper joked when Johann came to town for supplies. "That much rock overhead, and one of these mountain winds will bring the whole thing down on your family." Johann set his stones methodically, one every 2 to 3 feet along each rafter, creating a ballast system that would hold his upper roof in place against the mountain winds that could strip shingles from an unweighted deck. The technique was as old as the Alps themselves, used on stone and shingle roofs throughout the regions where winter came early and stayed late. But in a territory where most builders had learned their trade on the flat prairies or in railroad construction, the sight of a stone-weighted roof looked like an invitation to disaster. By early October, Johann's double roof was complete. The upper deck sat like a second hat above the first, with its continuous airspace, extended eaves, and neat rows of ballast stones gleaming in the autumn sun. Neighbors brought their children to stare at the strange construction, pointing up at the double outline of rafters and wondering aloud whether the whole assembly would survive its first real storm. Thomas Kearney, whose own cabin boasted a conventional single roof with minimal eaves and no venting whatsoever, remained convinced that Johann had wasted both time and materials. "Extra month of work for a roof that'll likely kill him," he told his wife Anna. "One good roof is all any sensible man needs in this country." But Johann finished chinking his walls, banked earth around his foundation, and split firewood for the winter with the quiet confidence of a man who'd built for the storms he expected rather than the weather everyone hoped for. When the first snows began falling in early November, his upper roof caught and held the flakes in an even blanket, while his neighbors knocked ice from their eaves with long poles, already fighting the melt-freeze cycles that would plague them through the months ahead. The first snow arrived November 8th, 6 weeks earlier than Thomas Kearney had predicted, and 2 months ahead of what the old-timers called normal. Johann Meyer woke to find 8 inches of powder blanketing his upper roof, lying smooth and undisturbed from eave to ridge. At the Kearney place, half a mile north, Thomas was already outside with a long pole, knocking icicles from his gutters after the previous day's brief thaw had created the first ice formations of the season. Anna Kearney watched from her kitchen window as her husband chipped away at ice ridges that had formed where their single roof's heated surface met the cold overhang. The phenomenon puzzled her. Their cabin stayed reasonably warm, yet somehow the roof created these troublesome ice dams that backed water under their shingles during every melt cycle. She'd already moved a wooden bucket to catch drips that had started appearing along the upstairs plate line, brown water stains marking where moisture had worked its way through the roof assembly. Johann, meanwhile, hung a mercury thermometer in his upstairs loft and began keeping careful records. On the night of November 15th, when the outside temperature dropped to 10 degrees, his loft held steady at 48 degrees, while his main floor stayed comfortable at 55 degrees near the stove. He burned roughly a quarter cord of split pine to maintain those temperatures through a week of cold weather, banking his coals each night and rekindling them each morning with dry kindling he kept in a box beside the fireplace. The same week, Anna Kearney mentioned to her husband that their upstairs bedroom never seemed to get above 35 degrees, despite keeping their stove running nearly around the clock. Thomas had burned through most of a full cord already, yet frost still formed on the nail heads that secured their roof boards, and their children's breath made visible clouds when they woke in the morning. The family had taken to warming bricks by the fire each evening, wrapping them in cloth and carrying them upstairs to keep their feet warm through the night. By December, the difference in firewood consumption had become impossible to ignore. Johann estimated he was burning about half a cord per month, while Thomas Kearney had already cut and split nearly 2 cords since the cold weather began. The Kearney cabin, built to the same general specifications as Johann's but with a single unvented roof, seemed to hemorrhage heat through the upper assembly despite Thomas's careful attention to chinking and weatherproofing. The technical explanation lay in heat transfer principles that wouldn't be formally documented by building scientists for another century. Johann's double roof created what researchers would later call a cold roof system, where the upper deck remained near outdoor temperature due to continuous ventilation in the cavity below. The airspace between his 2 roofs acted like a chimney, drawing cold air in at the eaves and exhausting it at the ridge. This constant airflow prevented heat from the living space below from reaching the upper roof surface, which meant the snow above stayed frozen rather than melting and refreezing at the eaves. Thomas Kearney's conventional roof, by contrast, allowed heat to migrate directly through the roof boards to the snow above. On days when the sun warmed the roof surface, or when heat from their stove made the attic space warm, the bottom layer of snow would melt and run down the roof until it reached the cold overhang, where it refroze into the ice dams that grew thicker with each cycle. The trapped water behind these ice ridges had nowhere to go but under the shingles and into the cabin below. Johann's extended 3-foot overhangs proved their worth during the first major storm of December, when a 2-day blizzard dropped 18 inches of wet snow across the valley. The weight of snow and ice on standard roofs created dangerous loading conditions, with several neighbors reporting creaking and sagging in their roof assemblies. But Johann's upper roof, designed to carry both snow load and stone ballast, bore the additional weight without strain. More importantly, when the storm passed and the sun emerged, meltwater ran cleanly off his upper deck and dropped well clear of his cabin walls, while his neighbors dealt with sheets of water running directly down their foundation logs. Anna Kearney found herself studying the Meyer cabin from her kitchen window, noting how the snow on Johann's roof lay in an even, unbroken layer, while her own roof showed the telltale bare patches and ice ridges that marked heat loss and thermal bridging. During a brief Chinook wind in late December, she watched meltwater cascade from Johann's extended eaves in clean streams that fell harmlessly into the snow, while her own cabin developed stalactite icicles that sometimes broke loose and crashed dangerously near the door. The measurable differences extended beyond just firewood consumption and ice formation. Johann's loft maintained a consistent temperature that allowed his family to use the space for storage and sleeping even on the coldest nights. The Kearneys had effectively lost their upper story to cold and dampness, with wet spots appearing on the ceiling boards and frost making the space uninhabitable for anything but the most desperate circumstances. By January, when the real cold began settling over the territory, Johann had burned through approximately 1¼ cords of firewood while maintaining comfortable living conditions throughout his cabin. The Kearney family, despite running their stove nearly continuously, had consumed almost 2 cords of wood and still struggled with interior temperatures that made daily life a constant battle against cold and moisture. Thomas reluctantly admitted to his wife that there might be something to the Swiss immigrants' building methods, though he remained publicly skeptical about the stone-weighted double roof that continued to draw curious visitors and pointed commentary from throughout the valley. The stage was set for the supreme test that would arrive with the legendary winter storms of 1887, when Johann's seemingly excessive preparation would prove to be precisely calibrated to the demands of a Montana winter that would push every structure and every family to the limits of survival. The blizzard that would define the winter of 1887 began building on January 9th with a peculiar stillness that veteran cattlemen recognized as the harbinger of disaster. Johann. Meyer stepped outside his cabin that morning to find the air unnaturally warm for the season, with temperatures near freezing and a strange pressure that made his ears ring. By noon, the first flakes were falling, not the gentle drift of typical snowfall, but heavy, wet crystals that struck the ground with audible thumps. Within 6 hours, the storm had transformed into a howling monster that dropped 16 inches of snow in the same number of hours. The wind drove the precipitation nearly horizontal, piling drifts against the north sides of buildings and scouring the south sides bare. Thomas Kearney, fighting his way to the barn to feed his cattle, found himself waist-deep in snow that had been level ground that morning. The temperature began dropping with the kind of relentless persistence that signaled a true Arctic outbreak, falling from 32 degrees at dawn to 18 below zero by midnight. Johann's double roof caught and held the massive snow load, the upper deck disappearing under nearly 3 feet of white that settled into a solid insulating blanket. The stones he'd carefully positioned along his rafters kept the assembly stable against winds that stripped shingles from less secured roofs throughout the valley. More critically, the continuous ventilation between his roof layers maintained the temperature differential that kept his upper deck cold enough to prevent melting, even as heat from his living space warmed the cavity below. At the Kearney cabin, the single roof struggled under the unprecedented load. Thomas had built to conventional frontier standards, with rafters sized for normal snow accumulation, and no allowance for the extreme conditions now testing every joint and connection. Worse, the heat escaping through his unvented roof assembly created a layer of meltwater at the interface between snow and shingles. This water ran down the roof until it reached the cold overhang, where it refroze into an ice dam that grew thicker and more dangerous with each passing hour. By the storm's third day, the ice ridge along the Kearney eaves had reached 14 inches thick, with icicles hanging like frozen spears from the drip line. The trapped meltwater behind this dam had only one place to go, backward under the shingles and into the cabin itself. Anna Kearney woke on January 12th to find water dripping steadily from 3 different spots along the upstairs plate line, soaking through the straw-tick mattresses and pooling on the rough board floor. The wet bedding lost its insulating properties almost immediately, becoming a conductor of cold rather than a barrier against it. Anna moved the children's beds downstairs near the stove, effectively abandoning the upper level to the advancing dampness and cold. The water damage spread along the ceiling boards, creating brown stains that marked the path of melted snow working its way through the roof assembly and into the living space below. Johann's extended overhangs, meanwhile, performed exactly as designed. When brief periods of warming created meltwater on his upper roof, the liquid ran cleanly to the edge and dropped 3 feet beyond his cabin walls, falling harmlessly into the snowpack below. The thermal break created by his ventilated cavity prevented enough heat from reaching the upper deck to create significant melting, so his roof remained largely free of the ice dam formation that plagued his neighbors. The temperature continued falling through the second week of January, reaching 46 degrees below zero on the night of January 15th. At these extreme readings, even well-built cabins struggled to maintain habitable conditions. The Kearney family, burning their stove continuously and consuming firewood at an alarming rate, could not raise their main living space above 40 degrees. Their damaged upstairs had become uninhabitable, with frost covering every surface and the wet ceiling boards beginning to sag under the weight of accumulated ice. Johann's cabin, by contrast, maintained an interior temperature of 45 degrees in the loft and 52 degrees on the main floor during the same brutal night. The combination of his stone ballasted roof system, thick log walls, and the insulating properties of the deep snow above his upper deck created a thermal envelope that retained heat with remarkable efficiency. He burned less than 2 cords of firewood through the entire month of January, while Thomas Kearney consumed nearly 3 cords and still couldn't achieve comfortable living conditions. The structural stress on conventional roofs became apparent as the extreme cold persisted. Several cabins in the valley developed visible sagging in their roof lines, with rafters deflecting under loads they hadn't been designed to carry. The combination of heavy wet snow, thick ice dams, and thermal stress from repeated freeze-thaw cycles created conditions that pushed frontier building methods beyond their limits. Johann's double roof system distributed the extraordinary loads across both the primary and secondary structural assemblies, with the ballast stones providing additional weight that actually stabilized the structure against wind-up lift during the fierce storms that accompanied the Arctic outbreak. The engineering principles he'd learned in Swiss Alpine construction, designing for extreme snow loads, and using mass to resist wind forces, proved perfectly suited to the Montana conditions that were breaking conventional frontier buildings. By the end of January, 3 families in the immediate area had suffered partial roof collapses, with ice dams and structural overloading combining to create dangerous living conditions. The Kearney cabin, while still standing, had lost the use of its upper level entirely. Thomas found himself making emergency repairs to his roof system, trying to clear ice dams with axes and long poles while fighting temperatures that made outdoor work nearly impossible. The contrast between Johann's comfortable, well-heated cabin and the desperate conditions in neighboring homes had become too obvious to ignore. The man they'd called foolish for his excessive preparation and dangerous roof design was sleeping warm and dry, while experienced frontier builders struggled to keep their families alive through conditions that seemed determined to test every assumption about what constituted adequate shelter in the American West. Anna Kearney knocked on Johann Meyer's door at daybreak on January 23rd, her breath forming ice crystals in the 40-below air as she explained that their upstairs had become completely uninhabitable. Water damage from the ice dams had soaked through their ceiling boards, creating a layer of ice that made the loft dangerous to enter. Her youngest child had developed a persistent cough that worsened each night in the damp cold of their main room, where the family now slept huddled around a stove that consumed firewood faster than Thomas could split it. Johann opened his door to reveal an interior that seemed impossibly warm and dry compared to the frozen wasteland outside. His loft space, measuring roughly 3 by 10 feet, had been designed to sleep his own family of 4, but he immediately began rearranging bedrolls and straw mattresses to accommodate the Kearneys. The upper floor, with its dry board ceiling and stable temperature, offered refuge that had become literally unavailable anywhere else in their immediate vicinity. Within hours, 2 additional families had arrived at Johann's cabin, their own homes rendered partially uninhabitable by roof failures and heating problems that had reached crisis levels. The Crawford family had lost half their roof to ice dam collapse during the previous night's windstorm, while the Andersons' cabin had developed such severe ice formation on the interior walls that their children's clothing froze solid within minutes of being hung up to dry. Johann's loft, never intended to house more than his immediate family, now sheltered 12 people in approximately 200 square feet of floor space. The adults arranged themselves on straw ticks laid side by side, while the children shared blankets in the spaces between. The additional body heat from so many occupants raised the loft temperature by several degrees, creating an environment that remained consistently above 50 degrees, even on the coldest nights, when outdoor temperatures plunged to depths that made normal cabin heating nearly impossible. The heat generated by 12 human bodies, each producing roughly 300 British thermal units per hour, combined with Johann's efficient roof system to create a thermal envelope that required less additional heating than any of the neighboring cabins had needed for their smaller populations. The families took turns tending the main floor stove, keeping a continuous fire that warmed both levels of the cabin without the devastating firewood consumption that had characterized their individual heating efforts. Thomas Kearney, sleeping under the double roof he had mocked as dangerous, found himself studying the exposed lower rafters in the dim light of early morning. The structural system that had seemed excessive in September now provided the stability that kept his family alive and sheltered. The ballast stones above, rather than crushing the occupants below, held the upper roof assembly steady against winds that rattled every other structure in the valley. The continuous airspace between the roof decks remained clearly visible, a gap that had seemed wasteful, but now obviously served as the key component in a heating system that outperformed every conventional cabin design in the area. Anna Kearney, practical by necessity and unencumbered by the pride that kept the men from acknowledging their mistakes, began asking Johann detailed questions about his roof construction. She wanted to know how he had calculated the spacing for his sleepers, where he had learned to leave the ventilation gaps, and why he had chosen to extend his overhangs so far beyond conventional practice. Her husband's expertise in railroad construction had failed completely under conditions that Johann's Swiss Alpine knowledge had anticipated and prepared for. The daily routine in the crowded loft revealed the superior performance of Johann's building methods in measurable ways. Children who had been constantly cold in their own homes slept comfortably through the night under his roof system. Adults who had struggled with chronic fatigue from fighting cold and dampness in their own cabins found their energy returning as they experienced truly warm, dry shelter for the first time in months. The contrast between their previous living conditions and the comfort available under Johann's excessive preparation became impossible to deny. Johann's firewood consumption, even with the increased heating load from 12 occupants, remained manageable at approximately 1 3/4 cords through the worst of the winter storms. The families he sheltered had collectively burned through more than 8 cords in their individual cabins while achieving far inferior results. The efficiency of his thermal envelope, created by the interaction between his double roof, thick log walls, and deep snow insulation above, demonstrated the superiority of traditional alpine building methods over frontier construction practices developed for milder climates. The social dynamics in the cabin gradually shifted from emergency refuge to informal education as Johann quietly explained the principles behind his roof design. Around the evening stove, with children sleeping in the loft above and adults sharing the warmth below, he sketched diagrams in the dirt floor showing how the ventilated cavity prevented heat loss while the extended overhangs shed meltwater safely away from the structure. His explanations, delivered in the careful English of an immigrant still learning the language, carried the authority of success in conditions that had defeated more experienced American builders. Crawford, who had initially dismissed Johann's methods as foreign foolishness, now asked specific questions about rafter sizing, stone placement, and ventilation calculations. The man whose cabin had partially collapsed under ice dam loading wanted to understand exactly how Johann had engineered his structure to carry not only the extreme snow loads, but the additional ballast that kept everything stable. The techniques that had seemed wasteful and dangerous in moderate weather had proven precisely calibrated for the extreme conditions that separated adequate shelter from life-saving refuge. By February, with the worst of the cold finally beginning to moderate, the families sheltered under Johann's roof had experienced firsthand the difference between building for normal conditions and preparing for the extremes that tested every assumption about frontier construction. The man they had called a fool had provided the only truly habitable shelter within miles, using methods that transformed what others saw as excessive preparation into the margin of survival that kept 3 families alive through the most severe winter in territorial memory. The Chinook winds that finally swept the Montana Territory in early March revealed the full extent of winter's damage to conventional frontier building. Thomas Kearney climbed onto his cabin roof to find rotted eave boards, water-stained shingles that would need complete replacement, and ceiling joists that had warped under repeated freeze-thaw cycles. Brown water stains marked every location where ice dams had forced meltwater backward through his roof assembly, creating damage that would require extensive repairs before the following winter. Johann Meyer's cabin, by contrast, emerged from the legendary winter virtually unmarked. His extended overhangs showed no staining where they met the log walls. His shingles remained tight and weatherproof, and his ceiling boards retained their original color and structural integrity. The 3-foot overhangs that had seemed excessive in moderate weather had kept every drop of meltwater away from his foundation and walls, while the ventilated cavity between his roof decks had prevented the heat transfer that created ice dams on neighboring structures. Crawford, whose cabin required complete roof reconstruction after the ice dam collapse, approached Johann with a sketch pad and specific questions. He wanted to understand the exact spacing of the sleepers that created the air gap, the sizing of the ventilation openings at eaves and ridge, and the method for calculating stone ballast loads that would stabilize the upper roof without overloading the structural system. His pride as a building expert had been thoroughly demolished by winter conditions that Johann's Swiss methods had handled without difficulty. Thomas Kearney, swallowing his skepticism along with his pride, asked Johann to help him redesign his roof system using the double-deck principle that had kept the Meyer family comfortable throughout the worst weather in territorial memory. Johann sketched the essential elements in the dirt outside his cabin: the 3.5-inch airspace created by sleepers set on edge, the continuous ventilation gaps that allowed cold air to flow through the cavity, and the extended overhangs that carried meltwater safely beyond the building envelope. The rebuilding that began in the spring of 1887 established new standards for roof construction throughout the immediate area. 3 neighboring homesteaders added second roof decks to their existing structures, using 2x4 sleepers to create ventilated air spaces above their original shingles. The Kearney cabin received a complete upper roof assembly with stone ballast and extended overhangs that projected 2.5 feet beyond the original eave line. Crawford's rebuilt cabin incorporated a double-deck system from the ground up, with proper ventilation gaps and structural support for both snow loads and ballast weights. The modified cabins reported immediate improvements in heating efficiency and interior comfort during the following winter. Families that had burned 2 to 3 cords of firewood the previous season found they could maintain comfortable temperatures with 1.25 to 1.5 cords, despite adding the ventilated air spaces that conventional wisdom claimed would make buildings colder. The elimination of ice dams meant no more water damage to ceiling assemblies, no more wet bedding from roof leaks, and no more dangerous icicles forming at the eave lines. Anna Kearney, keeping careful records of firewood consumption and interior temperatures through the winter of 1888, documented temperature improvements of 8 to 12 degrees in their upstairs rooms compared to the previous winter. The loft that had been uninhabitable during the legendary cold snap now remained usable throughout even the severest weather, providing storage space and sleeping areas that had been lost to ice damage and inadequate heating in their original single-roof configuration. By 1890, the double roof concept had spread beyond the immediate valley as homesteaders shared building techniques through the informal networks that connected frontier communities. Settlers arriving from the east received advice to build like the Swiss fellow if they wanted roofs that would survive Montana winters without creating ice problems or consuming excessive firewood. The method that had seemed dangerously foreign just 4 years earlier had become the accepted standard for anyone serious about long-term survival in high snow country. Johann's influence extended through practical demonstration rather than formal instruction. He helped neighbors calculate proper ventilation areas, showed them how to size structural members for combined snow and ballast loads, and explained the thermal principles that made cold roofs more efficient than heated ones. His quiet teaching, delivered in careful English, supplemented with sketches and measurements, transformed building practices across a region that had initially dismissed his methods as the foolish traditions of a backward immigrant. The Vindication continued into the 20th century as building scientists at land-grant universities began documenting the ice dam phenomenon that Johann had understood intuitively. Researchers at the University of Minnesota published technical bulletins in the 1970s describing how attic heat created destructive ice dams and recommending cold roof systems with continuous ventilation as the most effective prevention method. Their diagrams of proper ventilation ratios and thermal barriers replicated almost exactly the proportions Johann had used in his original 1886 construction. Modern alpine builders in regions like Big Sky, Montana, now routinely specified double-layer roof systems with cross-ventilated cavities as standard practice on high-snow residential construction. The techniques are promoted in contemporary building magazines as cutting-edge solutions to ice dam problems, though the fundamental principles remain unchanged from the methods Johann learned in 19th century Swiss valleys, where winter survival depended on understanding heat, snow, and structural engineering at levels that frontier Americans had never needed to master. The cabin Johann built still stands on its original foundation, though ownership has passed through several generations of families who maintained his double roof system through more than a century of Montana winters. The ballast stones remain in their original positions. The ventilation gaps continue to function as designed, and the extended overhangs still carry meltwater safely beyond the log walls. Visitors examining the structure can see the practical wisdom that transformed a mocked innovation into the foundation for modern cold climate building science, proving that some solutions work not because they are new, but because they are permanently correct.